Our number that moves the world this week is gross domestic product. So I want to start with talking about why gross domestic product is something we might care about, just to motivate the definition. Then we'll define it and then talk about ways in which we think about measuring it and how we might react to changes in it, and how policies and attributes and resources and feed into changing what GDP looks like over time, and how different countries have different GDP outcomes and how these also change over time. So to back up and think big picture, really when we're talking about GDPs, we're trying to imagine how we might measure the economy of a country. Naturally, economics is a very far-reaching discipline. We have economic research focusing on marriage and on the marriage market and on the way language spreads. And there's lots of different aspects to economics as a discipline, but in general, when we think about maybe the quintessential economic ideas, we're thinking about the system of commerce that we observe in free market economies, right? So we think about buying and selling, both products, services, and individuals' labor, right? So you just have all of this activity going on, and that activity in total represents something like all of the activity happening in a country. And if you have a country with more activity or with activity that produces greater output, then it's more economically active, and then we might naturally be curious about, well, what sort of decisions can we make as a country or as a political body that influence how active we appear. And so it makes sense just to step back and think, is there a way to try to measure how economically active a country is? And so gross domestic product is one overarching measure that serves that purpose. So it's used to talk in general terms about economic growth. So when we say, for example, that China grew at 10% in the fourth quarter of 2017, well, that's a reference to the GDP statistic, and it tells us something about how quickly economic activity is increasing in China. It also tells us something about the business cycle. When we think about the Great Depression, right? We put this in lots of different terms, where we talk about people lining up for soup kitchens, and we talk about, large, 20-some percentage rate unemployment, right? So there's sort of these things we can look at that say, oh, wow, the economic outcomes in the United States were really bad. But another way to look at it is to say that GDP, the gross domestic product of the United States, shrank considerably during the early onset of the Great Depression, which is, of course, not our usual case. Usually, commerce in general, slowly but surely, increases over time. And so it makes sense to want to think about, broadly speaking, how we measure this kind of thing. And so gross domestic product is the one we'll use. So what is it? Why do we care? So it's not just, let's measure how busy we are, but this feeds into things people actually care about. So if we have a lot of economic activity happening in a country, that economic activity feeds directly into the income of its citizens, right? So if, in essence, you can think about this in terms of our banking simulation, right? If I have a country that's producing a lot of product that the world finds useful, that produces revenue as those products are purchased, and that then feeds back into the wages of the people who produce them, right? So if you have workers who produce a lot of valuable goods, that's going to create a large measure of economic activity and will also create large paychecks for the workers, assuming they get a constant share of the output. And so economic activity feeds into wages and employment, which is very real to all of us. We have jobs and collect paychecks, and it's sort of a very normal thing. So even though on a national scale we have this gross domestic product for the entire country, all of the wages for the entire country are very closely related to the product, the gross domestic product of the country. And so that's another reason to care about what's happening with GDP, because it's going to indirectly at least feed into things like our paychecks and whether we're employed. So let's get to the definition. So the gross domestic product is the total market value. So we'll say dollar if we're thinking United States, but again, right, other countries have other currencies, but we can find the total value of their product in their own currency and then look up the exchange rate and make a conversion, right? So it's possible to find the market value of goods and services produced by any country in the world in dollar terms using exchange rates. So that's usually what we do, just to make it apples to apples comparison. So you have the total market value of all final goods and services. So why are final goods and services important? Well, you could imagine, right, that I could take a $10 poster from the Dixie Chicks, and I could sell it to my sister, who sells it back to me, and we just go back and forth and could run up everything. But it's not final, right? We would be, the idea is if I'm holding onto this poster just to sell it, I'm a middleman. I'm not the final destination of the poster. And so if we just bounce this back and forth, we could make GDP however big we want, which is, of course, not the idea, right? So we want to measure the final ultimate outcome, right? So if I am purchasing a hamburger at McDonald's and I eat it, it's done. It's over. It's not going to be anything else. And so whatever dollar value I paid for that hamburger is the market value of that burger, and that's the final thing, right? So McDonald's, of course, paid for some beef and for some flour or some buns from a supplier, but that's not going to be in the gross domestic product because it's not the final result, or it's not the final product. So you want the market value of the final product produced in a country during a time period. So this is a video rather than a picture, right? We want to sort of film the country usually for a year and say, okay, well, what's the dollar value of the final goods produced by a country in this year? Okay. So things that are not included, some of this right, so conceptually, right? So again, those non-final activities are not included on purpose by definition, but there's things that aren't included that probably should be, but don't end up in there because we don't have data on them. So work in the home, for example. So if I go find scrap lumber lying around the neighborhood, take it home, and build myself a table that would ultimately have a market value of $1,500, if nobody knows about it, it's not going to get measured. Right? So, and that's just kind of true in general. There's a ton of domestic activity that happens that we never see. So, for example, I've got a roast up in the crock pot that is slowly bubbling, and so there's an $18 roast, so that was an $18 payment made to festival, but it's going to produce a dinner that's worth a lot more than $18 in market value. If I had opened a restaurant, there would be, however many entrees that came out of that roast, it would be a lot. So the labor of cooking it into something delicious and ready to be eaten should produce GDP, but it's not going to make it into the measures. So basically because it's hidden. So criminal activity, again, because it's hidden. So if you can think about, right, so if I carefully sew some clothing and then sell it, and then report that would naturally be that's a product that would be included in GDP as long as it's getting reported, like on a tax return or something. But so I'm producing a valuable product that people are consuming and enjoy. That's included. But if I am producing an illegal product, so if I'm in Wisconsin and I'm growing marijuana, I'm not reporting any of that. It still gets consumed. It sort of functions like a shirt in that the ultimate customer consumes it, but now it's not getting in. So underground criminal activity is naturally just not going to get in because no one's reporting it. In the U.S., we do have an underground economy, but this is much more important in other places. So there are, in particular, countries with really high income taxes. A lot of economic activity happens off the books. So it's this. We hear this traditionally in the U.S. with small time trades. Like if you were a small time contractor that works for individuals. It's a consistent sort of tax compliance issue that these self-employed people tend not to correctly file their federal taxes, right? So, and you would like the work for cash sort of stuff, right? So if you're working for cash so that nobody knows about it, you're producing economic activity, but it's not going to end up in the measures because you're not telling anyone on purpose, right? So there's some things that deliberately aren't included because we don't want them there, but then there's a whole other aspect of the economy that doesn't get recorded because nobody knows about it. So I know, for example, in Russia, a huge component of the economic output of Russia is in home vegetable gardens. So the Russian people are just very committed gardeners and have big gardens that produce lots of delicious organic vegetables consumed in the home, but you have to kind of guess to make that work. So that's right. So final goods that are produced in a country. So this is our little rundown here. So pop quiz, right? This is a part of GDP. So a parent that stays home to take care of a baby, right? So this is happening in the home. It's producing. It's a service, right? It's a service to the baby, but no one's gonna know about it. So it's not going to get reported. It's not going to make it into GDP. Right? So no. And I can, right? So this is like, if I go down, you can cheat, right? So there it is. No, doesn't work. Dinner at a restaurant. Yes, absolutely, right? It's a final outcome. The meal is consumed. It's recorded, right? It's reported on tax returns. It will get in. Yes. Okay, dinner at home. So the answer to this is no, right? I'm not going to report the market value of my meal that I ate at home. But I am going to indirectly report the groceries, right? So Festival is going to communicate through, the natural channels, how much, what their annual revenues are, and then and of course then grocery stores, it gets extrapolated up and you make it. So the groceries are going to be in, but not the final dinner. Social Security check. So this one is a little tricky, right? So this is definitely it's a payment. It's a final payment, but Social Security checks are not included because they are a transfer rather than a payment for a service, right? So if I was providing a service to the government and then they were giving me a corresponding payment for that service, that would be appropriate to include in GDP. And that includes a lot of things like you wouldn't think of, like lobbying, right? So if I pay a lobbyist and they go lobby the government, that's a service. It's kind of not something you'd think, and you wonder, well, did the world get better because I lobbied? Well, I mean, we're not really applying value judgments when we do this kind of thing for the most part, right? But Social Security checks are very clear that it's not a payment for service, it's a transfer payment. So it's not included. A haircut. So a haircut would be generally, unless now in my family, my wife does every other haircut. So only half my haircuts are included in GDP. Construction of an office building. Again, right, so the standard would be, is this a final outcome? And the answer is yes, right? We're purchasing these supplies, and then we're constructing an office building that is now a finished product. And that's a new creation, right? It's a new creation, it's contribution to the overall, economic output, and it's final, so it's in. Right? So, which again is in contrast to the next one, the sale of a 10-year-old house. Right? It's already in existence. Right? The house is already there. The building of the house already made it into the gross domestic product. So a change in ownership does not qualify as some kind of increase in production. It's just a shift. Even if the house goes up in value, right, that's an investment return which is separate from a domestic product. Now, it's different if we're remodeling, or so like a remodeling improvement in the house would be a production outcome, but not just a swap and a price appreciation. Right, so just check, yes, no. Oh, oil change, right? So oil change, I go to the place and turn in my car, they change my oil, I pay for it. Yes, absolutely. Now, if I do it myself, it's not going to make it, but the oil would. So, again, things we can observe. Interest on a CD at a bank. So, that's important. This is an investment outcome, not a production outcome. And so, this is not in GDP. A new car. New car would be, right? Because, again, this is new production, final product. Now, if I go and sell my car later, that's not going to add anything, but the fact that I'm purchasing this, I'm the first purchaser of this newly produced thing, means it would be included. Tires purchased by Ford to put on a new car. This is tricky too, right? So the tires are what ultimately ends up on the car, right? So from the perspective of the tire manufacturer, it's sort of final for them, but right, and if I purchase tires at Sam's Club, that would be in, right? That's appropriate. That's a final sale to me. I'm the ultimate owner of it. But because these are purchased by Ford is putting them on a new car. The new car is then going to be sold. It's the new car that's the final outcome. So tires purchased by Ford would not be in GDP if we're doing the accounting correctly, right? So obviously that means that really, we line by line, this gets pretty complicated. But if you are willing to make some basic assumptions about how firms operate, we can get pretty reasonable estimates for the aggregate of this stuff. Okay, and partly, and partly because there's again two different methods that we can go about doing this. So, right, if you think about all of the production, so all of the stuff that's happening, all the products and services that are happening, we can add up all the value for all the products and services that are happening and get that total thing. But the other way to do it is to, rather than add up the value of what's produced, we could add up the value of what was used to produce those products. And, right, so again, this would be like, and they tend to be very similar. So if you think about your personal household, right, right? So what's the value of economic stuff that you produce versus the value of economic stuff you consume? Well, these are approximately equal, right? I produce some value for the university, I collect a salary, and then I buy a bunch of products and services using that money. Now, obviously there's maybe a little investment, right? Some cycles I'm buying more than I'm earning and borrowing to finance the consumption, or maybe I'm being a good saver and I'm buying less. But on the average, these things should add up over time or be approximately equal. And so at the end of the day, we kind of will use whichever one is more readily available data, and that tends to be the black circle here in the product market rather than the income market. But we can use either one and basically get to the same thing, basically for accounting reasons, right? That somebody else's revenue is somebody else's expenditure, and it should all kind of balance out at the end of the day. So that's that's the brief lecture on defining what GDP is and how we measure it and why we care. And so next we'll talk about some uses for it and thinking about what caused it to increase and decrease.